Hi, folks. James here, and welcome to the Spyro Circle, brought to you this time by Forbes Israel. There is no hotter topic recently than election integrity. We feel it in Europe, we feel it in the US, we feel it in authoritarian countries like Russia and China. We basically want to know that our vote counts for something and that governments are being honest about the results. Recent years have shown that trust in these institutions and in these processes has come under threat. I spoke to a company called Sequent that uses a cryptographic, open source auditability technology to help institutions and voting agencies with their processes. One of its founders and CEO, Shai Bargil, spoke to me about the state of democracy. He thinks it's in a bit of a limbo and needs to be revamped. We also spoke about citizen trust in digitalized processes. Paper ballots may be physically seen and therefore may be considered more accountable. But on larger scales, when people live overseas and people don't want to queue for hours on end, digitization of voting systems is the future, Shai argues. We just need to make sure that it's done in an honest and transparent way. The conversation was super interesting. We spoke about democracy and citizen trust and all of these things, and I really hope you enjoy. Shai, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, James. It's great being here.
I'm super interested in all of the things that your company is doing because of the effects that it can have on technology and democracy and trust and credibility all over the world. Before we get into it exactly what you folks are doing, I want to ask you, big picture, when people are talking about voting today and they're talking about elections and democracy, often now the word isn't participation and the word isn't representation, it's more about trust. So why has trust become such a central issue in elections today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have like two main answers for this. I think that first of all, people are kind of losing trust in the system today. It's very hard to track how election is being conducted. Whether it's on paper or whether it's digital, a lot of the times there's not enough transparency into the process, and what you see over time with election manager in general is that they add more and more measures to observe and to audit the election. In Israel, you get to a point when you have like a GoPro camera on the observers of the election, and you see the costs increasing more and more every year. So I think this is one aspect of trust in election, and it doesn't matter if it's happen on paper or digital. The need to observe and to audit and to trust the election is getting higher and higher with the year. Because election is such an important thing in our life. The second aspect is that I think all people also a little bit losing trust in the government and in the system. We see more and more governments trying to, or any kind of leadership, sometimes trying to take a control of the election. That is being noticed. More politics getting into the eventually what need to be an infrastructure and a process to serve democracy. So that's also contribute to the manner of trust. And there's also like some kind of tension, how much can I influence the election process for me to be re-elected, and how much this kind of election infrastructure and processes and, the electoral committee can be neutral and conduct the democratic process in a way that is in the best interest of the people. And this is also a tension that's happening. And I think we are going into a place when we're escalating those two drivers in terms of trust.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly, at least in the last kind of 10 years, decade or so, these questions about election integrity and voter trust and government credibility, all of these have been thrown into question. And that's where a company like Sequent comes in, right? So just for the listeners and viewers at home who may not be so familiar with you guys, you were founded in 2021 and you've received around $3.2 million now in funding to basically add a level of auditability and credibility and transparency to the remote voting system. Now, correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, but last summer, you just completed a wide-scale case study with the Philippines, where millions, I think it was 1.2 million or 1.6, maybe correct me on the exact number.
1.2.
1.2 million. So 1.2 million people from the Philippines voted in its election last year. So you folks are building the infrastructure to create a trustworthy open source system. So talk to me a bit about what it is exactly that you guys are doing to address some of these concerns.
Okay, so we established Sequent in June 2021, and before that, we really wanted to understand, when we go to develop digital election or online voting, we wanted to understand really, where this field need to go in the future. We did a lot of research about what the academic society did in the last 10 years. And what we understood that there is a big tension in digital election between how you maintain a secure and private ballot, but also how you create the transparency and the auditability that is necessary for digital solutions. And, when you think about it, it's going digital is really where all the government, municipalities, and organizations want to go. It's very, very hard to maintain and scale democratic processes by using just paper. Whether it's voting in person in the polling station, and then you have, people have to go there in person. It's time consuming. There's long lines. It's very cumbersome process. And also, if you need to vote remotely, when you want to operate a mail-in ballot kind of process and rely on the USPS, is very, very difficult. So we understood that digital is the right way, but you cannot go digital if you don't have the right measures of security and transparency into the voting process, because it's a public process. You need to maintain public trust, and this is where we understood that cryptography is the solution for that. It's not something that we invented. It's something that has been researched for the last 10 or 12 years in the academia. There was numerous amount of paper of how to do a secure and transparent voting. And basically what we do at Sequent, we just implement that in a very, very good way, scalable for elections that, for worldwide election, because they are very different from place to place. So what we did in Sequent, we basically developed an online voting solution that allow you to vote remotely. We start remotely, but eventually it's also going to be in person using digital voting machines. We're replacing initially the mail-in ballot operation. So you can vote from your mobile device or PC. It's an online voting system. It's a web-based application. It's very easy. But what really drives the system is the underlying cryptographic technology. And just to be very explanatory about it, cryptography is it's a field in mathematics that basically describes how you handle encrypted data. So encryption is cryptography, but there's also more advanced algorithms around that. And we have a full protocol that runs throughout the voting experience, from the moment that a voter is authenticated to how you cast your ballot, to how we record it in immutable kind of way. Again, it's not the blockchain, it's cryptography. But then eventually how we maintain security and privacy, and how we do the tally in a much more secure way than other solutions out there. But also at the same time, be able to provide mathematical proof, we can call it, evidence that every vote was correctly cast, recorded, and counted, and that the election results are accurate. And those kind of mathematical proof or evidence that the system create are fully auditable by any kind of third party or election observer, and you don't really have to trust neither the system or the vendor with the election integrity. And this is really the kicker here, because this is what was missing up until now in the digital voting space. So if you look at the current solution out there in the market, it just either it's a black box system, so it's a software that capture your ballot, then your ballot is being encrypted, and then this software need to decrypt the ballot, but you don't really know if the ballot has been changed while it's recorded, and even when they're decrypted, you don't really know if the decryption was done correctly because you have no idea how people vote. So there's no comparison kind of aspect. Again, because the ballots are secret and anonymized. This is the fundamental kind of requirement in every election. So when you have those softwares that eventually give you the plain text results of the election after they decrypt all the received ballots, you basically today have to trust the system and the vendor that they did what they have to do in the right way. And of course, nobody can maliciously manipulate the system with or without their knowing. And this is not acceptable in election. You cannot elect a mayor or you cannot elect a president when you have a voting channel that you don't really have the ability to audit it. And it's a very long post, it's a very long explanation, but this is really what is important, because if I'm election manager and I'm using different kind of voting system, whether it's voting in person by paper or voting by mail remotely or using online voting, I need to prove above all doubts that the winner won and the loser lost, and that should be acceptable by the public. And if I don't have auditability aspects or auditability capabilities on each voting system or each voting method, it's really hard for me to prove that. And think about very close races, right? When there's a lot of tension and you really need to make sure that the election results are accurate and nothing has been manipulated. So this is where the kind of technology that we developed, the cryptographic voting protocol, came into place, where it can provide those kind of evidence that can be verifiable by any third party to ensure that all the ballots was correctly cast, recorded, and counted, and nobody manipulate the system maliciously or not maliciously.
I think it's a great overview, and I think when you said just now, like, oh, sorry, I'm giving such a deep answer, but I think it's completely fair and appropriate to give an explanation like that, just to give people an understanding of what exactly is happening, because everyone has in their minds these elections that you just mentioned, the close call elections. Notably in the States, you had the 2000 election with the paper ballots in Florida. Then you had the 2020 election 20 years later when people were mailing in ballots. And so you've mentioned it a few times already about the difference between paper ballots and digital ballots. And there's a lot of, I suppose, generational change and maybe an attachment to nostalgia, because basically what you're saying is paper ballots were fine, but actually to have a digitalized, auditable, open source, transparent, large scale system in place that can be held accountable by anyone, and that isn't a black box, is actually a lot better. So in terms of the crisis that we mentioned at the
I wouldn't.
crisis, in terms of
Sorry, I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say it's a lot better. I would say that I think it's inevitable that countries and municipalities and organizations will move to digital. It's basically not sustainable to use paper and bring everybody to vote in person.
Right.
We saw how remote voting, mail-in ballot kind of developed in the last few years, and now 30% of all Americans vote in federal election by mail. And that's not going to go backwards. People don't want to come to the polling station. So election managers basically have no choice. They have to allow more accessible voting method. So I wouldn't argue if it's better or worse. I'm just saying, this is the reality. Now, if you move digital, do it in the right way.
Right. I should probably re-clarify. It's not better, but if it's going to go in that direction, it should be going in a direction that offers all of the things that people want out
Correct.
of their system, which is transparency, easy to audit, all of the things that we mentioned at the top of this call. Um, Obviously, we can't not address the conspiratorial ideas around some of these mechanisms. So the move to digital, people prefer paper ballots, or people don't want mail in. And I don't want to get into the nasty kind of stories or anecdotes that we probably all are familiar with over the last couple of years. I just want to touch on something that we spoke about ahead of this call, where I did mention this to you, and you said that conspiracy theories are valid around this kind of process. So, what did you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so we kind of addressing the current criticism that you have against that you have today toward voting systems, and even in the U.S. when you see the most loud criticism toward voting system, I wouldn't say that they are way off, and let me explain. Today, toward a digital voting system, there's a lot of criticism in the US, but the criticism comes because most of the systems today are pretty much black boxes. You cannot audit them. And of course, they don't provide any of those verifiable proof that we discuss. So when you become more reliable on digital election, and sometimes it's just something that they have to do. It's just impossible to kind of manage a paper-based operation. So when you rely on those systems, but you cannot audit them, even in a way that just understand how the software run and audit the source code, it's very difficult for the public to gain trust. And a lot of experts from computer science field and political science have criticism about that, and I think it's right. Some of those claims are more to the point and touch really important points, and some of the claims are more like populist kind of claims, and some people don't really have a deep knowledge about what they are criticizing, but nevertheless, this is a valid kind of criticism. So in our view, and when we built Sequent, it was very important for us, and it was very clear for us that whatever we build in terms of voting will have to be open source. So if this is open source, it means that anyone can review your code, can audit your system, can understand exactly what happened, and it's basically something that is public. And once you have this, it's allow all those kind of experts to review your system and have more confidence in what the system does and how they do it, and they can check it. And this was, for us, that was the first step in kind of mitigate the criticism that was built toward those systems, that we understand that it's also not something that we would like to be at, in this kind of black box situations.
Yeah, well, I want to touch on that because you're addressing a kind of modern day concern, which is the black box that is born out of these digital revolutions, and people's need for transparency and open source. And we're seeing that in the LLM era, right? I mean, when you put in queries into things like ChatGPT or Gemini, at first, for example, it wouldn't tell you where it got the information from. It would just say, this is the information. And then over time, people wanted to actually say, no, if you're giving me a result, I want to know where at least where you're getting it from. And then that's a whole other conversation about where those LLMs are getting those sources. But you're touching on something that is important, which is the need or the kind of expectation nowadays to provide that to people.
Yeah.
For context, you guys don't just do federal, like large scale elections. You do everything, right? You do any form of voting. So talk us through just like the tiers in which you operate, because it's not just electing the president, it's also helping the bowls club down the road. So talk us through a bit about that.
Yeah. First of all, I would say that you're absolutely right. Even the algorithm that X.com won or Twitter won, and affecting our kids and educating them should be public and open source, so we have some kind of control of what our youth is consuming. So I totally agree, and I think this is everything that is so important to be open source. Regarding election, so this is something that I was also learning myself when we started Sequent. Everybody vote all the time. We used to think as entrepreneurs about corporate, which by the way also vote, but we used to go to corporates and big company, typically in the US or England. But then you understand that when you get into the voting space, you understand that besides federal election or national election, of course you have municipal election, but then you have public organizations that vote all the time to elect their leadership or do referendums. So you can think about universities. Universities elect their board of trustees, the faculty representative, they have multiple elections every year. Professional associations, unions, credit unions, political parties, even a home association. We actually just won 3 million vote elections in Canada with 2 major large churches that elect the community leader per region. So anytime that you have some kind of organization that run in a democratic process, you have vote. So this is what Sequent today serve. But I will say that you have also 2 kind of approaches to that. You can, when you build this kind of company, and this is what typically happens, typically people start with an online voting system and they start from the small election. That's going to be the obvious kind of starting point. Let's start small and get bigger along the way. But Sequent took a little bit different approach. So we decided that we build the system toward the most complex, high-stake election. And the reason why we did that is because we understood that if we go bottom up, if we start with a small election and going up, we're just not going to develop the solution and the product that is required for the high-stake election. So in terms of the cryptography, the security, the transparency, we decided that we want to start with the most complex high-stake election and then to go downwards into most simplified election. And that's what gives us the ability to run all over and do 10,000 voter selection with the universities, but also 5 million voter election with the government. And that was, in my view, what is very unique about Sequent.
It's a huge accomplishment that already in such a young company, and you guys are fairly small. I mean, you have maybe a dozen employees or something, right? It's like 12 or 15 employees. You're still early days, and yet you're having such an impact on some of these democratic processes. What happens, because we've spoken about openness and transparency and cryptography as kind of, I guess nowadays, kind of essential tools to implement the kind of needs that are required in voting. What happens if governments, or not even governments, but what happens if the organizations that are having votes taking place, what if they resist that kind of openness? Is that something that you've come across, or something that could, do you think, happen? I don't know. I mean, what government in a shaky position would welcome, maybe this is the cynic in me, but welcoming such an open system, especially in maybe third world countries or even in countries where different states or regions operate their elections differently. So how does it look like in terms of getting everyone on board?
Actually, it's funny because the third world countries, as you call it, or mid-third world countries, are actually the ones that want more transparency, because corruptions and influence is part of the system over there. So again, whoever buys the system is not the government, it's the electoral committee. So typically the electoral committee will be going to be independent party. As long as the country want to run a democratic process, they will try to keep it independent as much, of course, as possible. But then this electoral committee would like to have the most transparent solution because of all the kind of opinion that they are toward that kind of state. And knowing that there are some more issues with with the democratic process. So they want the transparency. They want to involve more organization in auditing the system. They want to do the source code review. They want all of that. This is something that we see more in actually third world country compared to Western countries. But we actually never encounter a situation when someone wants less transparency or less verifiability.
So I want to now flip that. I want to flip that question on its head. So I asked about the kind of person at the top being anxious of transparency. I want to speak now about the everyday citizen, because we keep returning to it a bit, but the difference between paper ballots and digital ballots, the idea that with paper ballots, you can see it. So when you have voter, what are they called? Voter watchers, poll watchers. I can't remember the name of them now. But when you have people overseeing the process, there's something quite comforting about being able to physically see the paper. Now, I'm not talking about the validity of that paper or any of that, just in terms of the process. And when things are digitalized, you don't see any of that, obviously. So is it reasonable for citizens now, not the leaders, but citizens, to feel some form of skepticism? And how do you overcome, not even you, but how do companies, or, as we said, going into this new way of voting, how do you overcome some of those barriers of overcoming kind of maybe the skepticism that comes with, hey folks, I know we mentioned open source, but like for the everyday layman, hey folks, trust us, we're a digital company, we're going to take care of your elections. That's a big ask.
Yeah. So this is actually the kind of tension that election managers are handling. So there's always a balance between accessibility and confidence in the election, right? So if you want to make a ballot super accessible for everyone, you can use Google Form. But then, it's not secret, it's not anonymized. Nobody will trust it. And if you want to make it super secure, super trusted, then you want to bring everyone into the polling station, go behind the curtain, verify everything by paper. But then this is a much more cumbersome process, and people will suffer from that. I think in 2022 we saw like 5, 6, 8 hours lines outside of polling station in the US. So, and people were very desperate and frustrated from that. So there's always a balance between accessibility and security and confidence in the election. And this is what the election manager have to kind of overcome. So in practice, there is always a combination between in-person voting, digital or by paper, and remote voting, which can be online voting. So what you will see, the way people are typically handle that, or election manager are handling that, is that in high-stake election, they will always give you the option to vote in person, but also the option to vote remotely. So, and typically voting remotely online will happen before election day. So you have 1, 2 weeks, 1 month that you can vote remotely. And then also, so it's like it's going to be like a provision of the ballot. So also you can still go in election day and vote in person. And this is important because voting in person, it's basically the only situation when you can guarantee a secure environment when people can go behind the curtain and vote by themselves. You cannot guarantee that when you vote from home, either online or by mail. So in high-stake election, you would always want to allow in-person voting on top of remote electronic voting. Having said that, in a much more low-stake election like municipal or primaries or union elections, this is more tend to be some kind of consideration that election managers are doing, and personal preference of the members of the organization or the citizens in the same city. And sometimes they will go completely fully digital. Now we see some municipalities in Canada that allow only digital remote voting in their election in 2026 in October. And some of them will decide that they also want to do the in-person voting. So it's really a preference. We're not trying to convince election manager how to run the election. We just give them the option to do it the way they want to do.
Yeah, but I imagine it's their responsibility to try to convince the citizen. It's not your responsibility to convince the citizens.
Correct.
It's their responsibility. So I imagine just now the example you gave on Canada, saying I can't remember what level it was, but where they said it was only digital. I mean, I'm just thinking of myself in this conversation, and I vote in two countries, and one of them, the country I'm in, I vote in person, obviously. But for England, a lot of the time, I send my mail-in ballot, but I also get someone in England to fill out my physical paper form for me. They say, who do you want me to tick the box for you? I tell them, and they do it for me. So, as you just mentioned, going behind the curtain, that is verifiable. That's the person doing it, especially if the person has to provide ID, like you have to do in Israel. You may not have to do that in other countries, notably, of course, famously the US. How do you tackle that form of verifiability? How are those verified? Because a big criticism on paper ballots, even though it's legacy, nostalgia, people are familiar with the physical process, there are questions of identification. So is that something in the process, or is that, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah. So we see now more and more voices, especially in the US, for voters to be identified, even if they are coming to vote in person. And this is even more severe when you vote remotely, because if you're voting by mail, you basically don't identify in any way. You just sign the affidavit, right? So how can we be sure that you are the one that actually voted? This is something that digital voting solves, especially for the remote voting cases. So we have an authentication kind of a system that we can integrate any third-party solution, or we have our authentication solution, and it can be fully biometric. So it doesn't matter if you scan your ID and take a facial kind of selfie, and that is being reviewed, and then we determine your eligibility and allow you to vote. Or in some other places in the world, they even actually sending you a physical mail with one-time password that is only for you, and then you have to log in with multi-factor authentication, with multiple parameters, and then they identify that who you are, who you say you are. And this is how digital voting solved that, and it's actually tremendous improvement than what we have today by mail. So in my view, even in terms of authentication and in terms of operation and also in costs, there's no more justification for a mail-in ballot. This is something that is becoming more and more absolute. And you have today solutions in terms of remote voting that can replace that.
Yeah, it's a completely foreign idea to me that voting should be done completely anonymized with no form of ID required. I mean, I think and this is nothing to do with your company or nothing to do with your system, but just conceptually for me, it's a very strange idea that people would try to promote anonymous voting without any form of verification at all required, whether that's digitally or physically on paper. You mentioned before, you said something that stuck with me. You said democracy is in limbo a little bit. That was the kind of, when we've spoken before, that you mentioned that, and I've never really heard that before. So talk to me a bit about what you meant by that, and I want to get into then later how we can maybe reverse that.
Yeah. So when we build Sequent, obviously we develop what we arguably claim, the best online voting solution out there. And we invest a lot in the technology and a lot of privacy and security and also transparency. And this is something that is very important for us. And we help government and organization to move toward that way. But basically, we have the understanding at the beginning, and this is part of the reason why we kind of was very excited and bullish about building Sequent, is that we saw that democracy is a kind of, you can say, limbo, or kind of in a position where it's no longer working for us. I think we all feel it a little bit in our hearts that, the system that you go to elect your representative every 3 or 4 years, and then you expect that this representative in the Congress or in the Parliament will represent you correctly for every kind of decisions that need to be taken in the next 3 to 4 years is almost no longer valid. and the only chance that you have to kind of reconcile it or to do it again in the next 2 years. And, we get a lot of promises by then, and maybe we forget what happened, and then we go in the same cycle again and again. And then when we really want to put our voice out there and we want our voice to be heard, we do that by either protesting or, expressing our opinion in Twitter or on social media. And then how much of this voice is impactful? And this is kind of a situation that I think many of us already experience. And then once we understand that, you have to ask yourself, okay, what is the next stage of democracy? How democracy will be in the future? What's going to be the change that will allow us, the Western world, kind of move toward something that is a little bit more in according with our needs in the future? And, I study my bachelor. I have B Science in Information Technology, and then I have a master in political science. And in political science, there are many new models of how democracy can be in the future. If you want, we can go into it.
Sure, yeah. It reminds me of the quote where it's like, I always thought, democracy is where two idiots can outvote a genius. It was always something that because I studied politics in school as well, so it was always something that we spoke about. But please go into it. I'd love to hear about how we can unstuck democracy.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people are sharing your feelings.
Yeah, so I think we all understand the limbo situation, and one of the nice models that I like, and by all means, it's not the only model, and I don't think that this is the answer, but just as an example, there's a concept that's called a liquid democracy. That liquid democracy is basically trying to find the gap between representative democracy and direct democracy. So obviously, direct democracy is not something that we can do. Everybody vote on all the topics all the time is not something that we want to do. It's not something that is feasible. We have our life. We don't want to handle everything. But we do want to impact on what is important for us. And maybe what is not important for us, we would like to delegate. So this is exactly what the liquid democracy says. Liquid democracy says that I have my vote and I can, basically vote on anything that I want, but I can also delegate my vote. So let's just say that James is an animal rights expert, and I totally trust his kind of opinion. So in anything that related to animal rights that require us to vote on, I can delegate my votes to James. And James can take now 2 votes that he have, mine and his, and can delegate it to another thought leader that he feels that is the best expert in animal rights. And this is kind of, and this kind of expert or thought leader can kind of collect a lot of votes and vote on those kind of topics in our behalf. But at the same time, I can revoke my vote from this kind of expert and take it back and maybe give it to someone else. But let's just say that anything that related to national security and like kids until the age of 3 and maybe small businesses is very important for me. And I want to keep those kind of rights to vote directly on any kind of bill or legislation that's happening. So in this kind of way, I vote on what I care about, but also I create kind of a dynamic representative system that is continuously being reviewed and under kind of scrutiny or being evaluated, and that can happen automatically. So this is kind of a system that could be a great way for us to move forward. And again, this is just one example. But what you understand is that if you want to implement those kind of system in the future, it's impossible to do that, with voting centers and doing that on paper and making all this kind of cumbersome process. You have to have something digital. You have to be able to vote from a mobile device. It has to be very, very cheap, 10 cents per vote. And it has to be super secure.
And it has to be accessible to everyone. There can't be any barriers to entry.
Exactly. But it also have to be very efficient and cheap. Because, you're going to do a lot of voting all the time. And, and again, it has to be super secure and trusted in the same way that that today, normal elections are being trusted. And if you have that, you can start thinking about more advanced democratic processes and models. So Sequent is, is building the next secure, verifiable online voting system. But if you think about it, that can also be the infrastructure for this kind of, if you want the AWS for this kind of future fuel for, for democracies. And we believe that we are doing the first steps right now.
It's really interesting because a lot of talk, and we said this at the start of the conversation, democracy is about representation, or that's kind of some of the things that people think of. And what you're kind of saying with this form of democracy is that you flip that and you actually make it more, not representation, but more delegation. It's more, I don't know these things, so I'm going to vote for someone who does know these things. And that's personally how I felt when Brexit was coming along. And you talked about direct democracy, and it was kind of a referendum in some ways is the most direct form of democracy because it's a simple yes or no question that the government poses to the people, and they go. It's not binding, so they don't have to do it, but they kind of do it. They go on the answer of the people. And I remember thinking, why am I voting on the UK's position in the EU? I'm voting people to make these decisions for me, these economic or social or historic decisions with knowledge that I don't have. I'm always interested when people are like, well, X% of voters with college degrees vote this way. It's like, well, what's a college degree going to do in terms of other serious political issues with big consequences? So it's interesting. In some ways,
that's true. But
democracy is a delegation instead of a representation. I don't know.
Yes,
it was just interesting.
That is super correct. But think about the fact that you can, have your representative or you can delegate your vote at any given time. You're not bound into this 4-year cycle. And again, if you think
that's
about
asking a lot of people to constantly delegate, or is that how would that work in terms of it? Because some people like the idea of okay, here's the one vote, and now I don't have to think about it for 4 years. I'm not like that. I would rather vote on everything, but it's
think about an application when you have all the bills and legislation, and you can just decide if you delegate your vote to all of them to one person or part of them to multiple persons. So, but it's available for you all the time. You can do that once and forget about it, and change it in the next 10 years, or you can vote on everything that you want all the time. It's really up to you. And I think people now in Western worlds are kind of want this kind of flexibility and to be able to choose from themselves all the time, more and more and more. Just see what happened worldwide. People are trying to make their voice heard, but there's no impact. And the next impact that they have the ability to do, at best case scenario, is in the next election cycle.
Shai, I would love to keep talking all about these issues, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. We have a hard stop. I need to close it soon, but I have a few more questions for you, and then a quick fire round. So I want to do that as quickly as possible. So I'll go ahead and start right now in the interest of time. If democracy is in limbo, as we just mentioned, what are some of the ways what's one major way that it could move forward? Better tech, better leadership, or better civic education?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, but it's all the above.
Okay.
We need to invest more in tech. That's for sure. We have a lot of more investment to do in our technology to make it global and public and trusted the way we want it to be. Education is very important, like anything else in life. And it's also a matter of leadership, because what you see now is that you see more and more millennials kind of generation going into power. And that brings also the change from, digital kind of government and engagement with citizens. And we see that more and more coming.
That's going to change politics entirely, and politics is culture. So it's going to be super interesting. I have a few more questions here. What is your biggest concern for elections? What would make you personally trust it more?
It's a big question. I think my biggest concern for election is that it becomes something that people don't want to be engaged with. the people losing trust and losing interest in election and start feeling that their voice matters and impactful, I think this is the bigger risk. Because then people think about different models to govern.
What scares you more? You just mentioned both of them: low turnout or high distrust.
Distrust is the most important thing.
Okay.
You can increase turnout. You cannot easily increase trust.
Interesting. I was thinking the other way. It's like low turnout. It means that no one's taking part, but trust is as long as the system's in place. Trust can be anyway. Yeah, it's interesting. We could keep talking forever about this. I love these kinds of conversations. My final question for you, Shai. My final question for you, Shai. What is the best way for people who are watching or listening this to get in touch with you or follow some of the things that you guys are doing and learn a bit more about some of the election processes that you folks have impacted?
Yeah, so we obviously very much engage with the academic community, and also because we are open source, our code is visible on GitHub, and people can review, help, contribute. We actually encourage that to build a community around our system. So anyone can go to our website. There's a connection form. It's a Sequent with 1t.io. And whether they want to engage with us in any kind of help, assistance, or they want to review our code and be a contributor to a GitHub project, they are most welcome.
Wonderful. Shai, I'll make sure to put the link down below so people can hold you to that and hold you to be accountable and transparent. Shai, thank you so much for your time today. It's been super interesting. I wish we could continue talking, but we have to close it for now. Maybe we'll get together in a year from now and we'll see some of the impact of how democracy has changed in this year. But for now, we have to close. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. It was great talking with you.